delighted today to have Matt Garner join me for our Careers in FM Spotlight series. Matt is a current Vistage chair, and for anyone that doesn't know Vistage are a CEO coaching and peer advisory business, great business we've been involved with in the past. As well as that, Matt is a senior consultant at Facilities Management Consultancy Litmus Partnership. Prior to that, Matt was Chief Exec of Gov Facility Services and before spent many years at Sodexo, latterly as MD of the government schools business across the UK and Ireland. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the intro. It makes me feel old.
Definitely not old. So Matt, when we've been doing these spotlight series in the past, we've just been finding out a little bit about people's career journeys into FM, really. So very excited to hear about yours.
Okay. So I probably, like lots of people in FM, ended up in FM before it was even called FM. So I graduated as a building surveyor in the early 90s and went to work for a local authority in what was called the maintenance department at the time. And it only really became FM as an industry in the sort of mid to late 90s. So I've been in FM as we know it for 25 years. Was it a choice to go into facilities management? No, but it's been a fantastic experience because of the amount of variety. So, I've gone from looking after schools and local authority maintained housing and police stations and things like that, into capital projects, into working across the UK and Ireland. Met some amazing people, not been without its challenges, and I think at its simplest for me, FM is all about people providing services for other people, and helping organisations with improve their outcomes by providing great space for their people to be able to do what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've touched on some of the variety. You've worked quite a lot across the education side of FM, haven't you? And that in itself brings variety into the mix. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those contracts and the differences of things that you have been involved in?
Yeah, so there's two elements to the variety. One is in the variety of services that you look after as a facilities manager. I come from a construction hard services background, but I've also looked after catering contracts and student accommodation and specialist decontamination units for the NHS. I've worked in pathology, none of which were anything really to do with construction. So there's that element of the variety that's kind of kept me interested over the years. But there's also the variety of the types of buildings that you work in as a facilities manager. That I've worked on temporary buildings for things like London Olympics. I've worked in Grade 1 listed buildings. I've worked in laboratories. I've worked in sort of high-end offices across cities in the UK and Ireland. Pretty much everything. Military barracks, that's quite interesting. Prisons as well. There's a strange correlation between prisons and schools, actually. They're quite similar to look after in lots of ways. But again, that was quite a fascinating experience, just understanding how those buildings work for the occupants that are within those buildings. Some pretty famous sites, Dartmoor Prison, and then I look back on my education experience and working with the likes of Eton College and organisations like that. But also those much smaller, where multi-academy trusts, where they've got lots of schools, and some of them are quite small, and they bring with it their own challenges. So For me, the it's been the variety that's kept things interesting, and never quite knowing from one day to the next what's going to happen, and realizing pretty early on in my career that there's always somebody who knows more than I do. The interesting thing is learning, and listening to other people's experience, and helping other people be really good at what they do.
Great. And on the skills side then, how do you feel through your career you developed skills, and what skills do you feel were really, really necessary for a career in FM?
There's a technical element of it, which as as one progresses a career, that probably becomes less important. What becomes more important is people, and your ability to work with a huge variety of people, from your own frontline staff through to senior leaders in businesses, and to be able to actually interact with people in a meaningful way. That journey into leadership is probably harder than becoming a chartered surveyor. And learning how to be a leader is difficult, and I think it's a skill you need to learn. It's not something that you can just it doesn't just happen by osmosis. Because you've worked with somebody who's really good, you are therefore going to become a really good leader. I don't think it works like that. I think you have to develop yourself as a people manager, and you have to develop a degree of either competence or conscious incompetence in areas of the facilities industry that you're not an expert in. It's really easy to say, well, I run 12 different services across a big estate, but you're only ever going to be an expert in one or two of those. So it's that kind of knowing where to go for help, for expert advice, because there's always somebody who's been there before.
And you've been involved in a number of PFI contracts as well with the schools, haven't you? And very topical, obviously, now with PFI handback and everything that's going on there, and a lot of talk around the skills that are needed for that today. The softer side, the skills that really come into play. Did you find that particularly when you were dealing with those contracts then?
Yeah, PFI gets a bad rap. I think as a country, we've forgotten that we invested in a whole load of infrastructure and we've got to pay the mortgage back. So it does get a bit of a bad rap. But to go back to what I said earlier, is set aside the contract, which can be complicated and 428 pages and all of that. Actually, it's still about people providing services for other people. And I think sometimes as an industry, we get a little bit fixated around contract and compliance and payment mechanisms and service failures and the commercial element of it and the legal element of it. But maybe you just forget sometimes that actually this is about people doing things for other people. That's not to say you can ignore all of the contractual compliance stuff, because therein lies disaster. But it's about a balance between, technical service delivery, compliance, contract management, and engaging people. Because if you haven't got any people, you can't deliver the service. If you can't deliver the service in a PFI, that's quite painful.
Yes. And dealing with a number of different stakeholders, isn't it? And that, collaboration and making sure all different stakeholders are working together in the best way possible.
Yeah, and I'm sure anybody who's had any real involvement in PFI will be able to cite examples of where it really is a partnership. It's a public-private partnership, and everybody's aligned and everybody's working together. Doesn't necessarily mean they agree all the time, but they are working towards a common goal. There are others where the relationships have got to a point where they're toxic, and I've seen really bad behaviour by the public sector, by the private sector, by anybody and everybody who's been involved in PFIs, it can get a little bit personal, it can get a bit nasty, and that's not a good place to be.
So probably leads us on to challenges, as actually nicely. What would you say the main challenges are that you've faced in your career, and perhaps could you give some tips on what you feel has helped you to progress and grow?
I think the challenges have been the variety. You go from being an expert in a certain field into much more general management and service leadership, and that it does take a mindset shift to move into that space. I when I did my degree and graduated, and I can even remember that far back, turned up in an office and thought, right, I've got a degree, I know everything. It took me about an hour to realise that I didn't know anything at all. And if I were to spend time with the people who've been doing that job for 20 odd years, I'd learn way more from them. So challenge for me has been around recognising my own gaps in my own knowledge, and then being humble enough to listen to other people and ask for help when I don't know the answer. I think that another challenge as a facilities manager or the facilities industry is we try and be everything to everybody, but just be really clear about what it is you are, what you bring, and what your service is, rather than trying to be brilliant at absolutely everything, because you can't be brilliant at everything. Much as it came as a surprise, you can't be brilliant at everything. You have to choose what you're good at doing, and recognise that, and recognise what you're not so good at doing.
Yeah.
And the people element has and continues to be a challenge, because people are people, and one person's perception of a situation is very different to another person's perception of a situation. Particularly when you're trying to deliver services, particularly in a PFI where those contractual requirements might have been written 25 years ago, and the world's changed, and the world's moved on. You said any sort of tips and pointers. I think one thing I learned was read the contract, know your contract, because everybody will have a perception of what you should do, particularly on the soft services. When you're looking at cleaning or catering, lots of people will have an opinion of what good looks like. So read your contract, understand what you've committed to do, deliver on what you said you were going to do, and if you're not going to do it, hold your hands up and say, really sorry, can't do that at the moment because of these reasons. And just be honest about it. And I guess the final thing for me is understanding your customer, understand the consumer. We did a really interesting piece of work at Sodexo when we rebuilt the school food offer, and that was actually going out to interview a bunch of children because they were our consumer. And funnily enough, they had a very different perception of what a good school meal looked like than we did as adults, and the adults who were commissioning our services had. But if we weren't providing a service that met the needs of the consumer, we really weren't achieving very much at all. So, listen to your consumer, build your service around the insight that gives you, rather than develop something that you think's brilliant, but nobody wants to buy.
Yeah. Advice then for aspiring FM professionals out there. Have you got any advice that you would give?
Embrace the variety. Believe in yourself. Find something that really excites you. And whether it's a particular service, or it's a particular sector, or it's a particular type of building, or whatever it might be, find something that gets you up and running when things go a bit wrong, because they do. And accept the fact that things won't always go according to plan.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Matt, for your insights into your career and tips for the future in FM. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks
Nice to
very
see you.
much. Bye.
Bye.